We got the Guilford Courthouse, and who was the swamp fox who did the guerrilla tactics? Francis Marion. And, I don't know why I said it that way, what battle would bring the French into the war? Now, I can't remember. Yesterday, did I talk about Saratoga and give you an example if you're doing that for like a short ID?
Yes. Yeah.
So I didn't talk about yes. And think about short ID, so I remind you for tomorrow. You try to get as much information. What, when, where. You get those basic information down. If you don't know the exact date, give me decade or at least era, try to describe it. Put as much information as possible to describe it. But then the most important thing, you have to put down why it's important. Right? Saratoga, that's bringing the French into the war, making it a world war. You know, like Bacon's Rebellion was that whole thing about delete the slave codes and racism. You have to get why it's important.
Why did they call it the World War I?
Different type of war. And the thing is, you have to get back down. That is the meat of this. All of you, every one of you, can just do a quick little brief summary. I know that. But the critical thinking is to say how this led to something important. This is why it's important. And it will make it a lot easier to remember. And make it more interesting. If it just becomes individual facts, then it becomes trivial. This is individual facts. Yeah.
Can you possibly get back up the first ID that we
Oh yeah, you know I forgot to hand that back. It's been sitting over here and I forgot to do that. Why don't we remind me again, I'll hand it back when I'm going through the review and stuff.
Okay.
So that's your job, just remind me. I put it back here to hand back and then I have a bad habit of that. I'm really sorry. I just get going. You know, I'm moving on and I'll forget to hand things back. Do you forgive me for that?
Yes.
Well, I guess this was going to be 9 out of 10, but out of 10 points. I guess now it's going to be that score out of 100. Anybody else have a little complaint? No, I'm really bad about that. I'm sorry. So, with that, after Guilford Courthouse, that is when Cornwallis went to the sea. And what did Greene do? Did I say that right when the bell rang?
You were like talking about it and the bell rang and you're like, let me finish. But we did.
Okay, so the thing about Greene, he basically just reconquered the rest of, or liberated, it's another way to look at it, North Carolina and South Carolina. He just went step by step, and that's why Greene's statue is everywhere down south.
Didn't you get all the credit? No, that was never mind.
That was at Gates who got all the credit. Who is the most famous traitor?
Benedict Arnold. I was going to say Arnold Benedict.
Arnold Benedict.
Really?
And the Royal Navy picked up Cornwallis. He actually went up to Virginia and joined Arnold for a while. Arnold was leading Loyalist cavalry in the Civil War here, really bloody. But then Cornwallis realized that it has failed. The Southern strategy was a disaster. We have made too many enemies. Remember I talked about getting food and then also reprisals for guerrilla attacks. And that is when he decided to go back to the sea and wait for the Royal Navy to pick him up. You know, the great advantage the British have is the Royal Navy. So on the James Peninsula, remember Jamestown, that first colony, on the other side of the peninsula, on the York River, is Yorktown. Now, Guilford Courthouse might have been enough to knock the British out. Remember, these wars are political. And that could have been enough to say it's not worth it. Let's cut our losses and keep the rest of our colonies. Yorktown would assure it. Because Cornwallis went there and then had to wait for the Royal Navy. So it's August going into September. Cornwallis went to the Yorktown to wait for the Royal Navy, the British Navy, to pick him up. Basically to evacuate. And the main British force, though, is still in New York. Washington is in New Haven. Washington has around 13,000, 14,000 men, half are French. Washington hears about this down in Yorktown, and he and Rochambeau, the French commander, I told you this yesterday, that is a great name, right? They come up with an idea, literally a risk everything, which he could kind of do. What if he could surround at Yorktown? surround Cornwallis and Yorktown and force them to surrender. The problem is, even if he gets there by land, the Royal Navy could come in and take him out by sea. So he needs a French fleet to blockade the Chesapeake Bay right there. And remember the Treaty of Paris of 1763. France lost New France, which is Quebec. But they kept those two islands, the biggest being the western part of Santo Domingo, Haiti now. They kept that. They had a fleet down there. The British, therefore, had to keep a fleet down there to protect Jamaica or Bermuda. What's the big product they all cared about? That's sugar. So, through Rochambeau, they sent word down to Haiti, Santo Domingo, and asked the admiral there, an admiral named de Grasse, and they asked him, would you be willing to take your fleet from here and blockade here? Now, the thing was, he had 17 ships of the line. Another term later on they called a battleship. Okay, just kind of briefly talk about how they fought on land back then, how they would line up in nice rows and kind of come right. Remember that? On the sea, they weren't much different. The big ships, and they would have 3 decks with anywhere from 50 to 100 guns. They'd be really top heavy. And those big ships were called ships of the line, battleships. And their plan was basically to line up in a line across from each other about a quarter mile apart and blaze away. So if you're looking down on this, there's a ship, right? Pretty good, right? Now I'm just these. The rest of them not quite as seaworthy. And they would just blaze away at each other. Blaze away until ships started getting sunk, they started getting holes, the crews started getting killed, and then they would basically come pretty close to each other and board each other with naval infantry. Marines. That's what Marines are. And that was the tactics, not much different than land. So the big battleships were ships of the line. The French had 17 down here. 17. The British, no, I'm sorry, not 17. 19. They had 19. The British had a much bigger fleet worldwide, but remember now they had to defend everywhere. So they only had 17 in Jamaica, right about here on this map, and 12 in New York. If the British could unify both fleets, they're too big for the French to handle. But August, September, October, what season was that? But it's hurricane season. In 1759, a French fleet in the Caribbean was hit by a hurricane and destroyed 100 ships, big and small ones. Can you imagine what a hurricane would do to all the riggings and the masts and those top-heavy ships? And how did you find out? Oh, how would you know that a hurricane was coming in 1759? 100-mile-per-hour winds. That's how you found out. You didn't have connection to the satellite yet. And so, boom, it hit. Who's going to risk getting caught in the hurricane if a hurricane comes? And here's why those 2 islands from that treaty were so important combined with hurricane season. The French, they took the risk. They did it. All 19 ships of the line went up here to the Chesapeake. The British down in Kingston, Jamaica, decided no. They were worried if they're caught there, they might not only lose the colonies, but maybe Jamaica. They're thinking the sugar. So when the 19 French ships arrived, the 12 ships from New York saw them, realized they weren't enough, and turned around. The British blockaded them from the sea. Here they show like a little thing, like it's a battle. It wasn't a battle. The British just realized they're outnumbered and went back. So now the sea. So hurricane season, help with independence. And then Washington, he had to convince the British garrison in New York not to attack, and then he could march overland. Took weeks to get there. There's no roads. There's no bridges. They have to ford every river. And so I drew this up here real quick, put this up so that kind of pointed things. What the British are here. What they did is they faked an attack on New York and it worked. The British stayed in place to hold New York. They weren't sure how many soldiers they had, so they stayed. And so then he just kept a couple thousand men and took almost everybody as fast as they could march here. As fast as they could go. One of the leaders on the march was a French nobleman who came over a couple years earlier when he was age 19, inspired by the Declaration of Independence. And his name was the Marquis de Lafayette. And Lafayette, now 21, Washington really admired him, and he had some military training, so he would actually be the first soldiers on the march. He actually led Continental Forces, a French leader. He would later go on to, in the beginning, start the French Revolution, help the French Revolution. Then when the French Revolution got radicalized, he barely escaped with his head. He'd come back to the United States as an older man in 1830, and he would go from town to town, and they treated him like a hero. Lafayette. Kind of became legendary. Look at America and what they did. If you go to Washington, D.C. right now, the park right in front of the White House is Lafayette Park. It's right there. There's a statue of President Andrew Jackson in the park. So, they went overland. The Americans were really, the Continental Army was really jealous of the French. The Continental Army had whatever ranks they had, and the march going through swamps, and it rained, and mud, and fording rivers, they were filthy. Well, the French, not only did they march in good order and were better equipped, every morning when they would begin the march, they looked great. The French, typical French, right? And here's the thing. What color uniforms did the French wear? White. How can you keep clean with white uniforms, white wool uniforms? You know how they did it? Every morning it looked great. Too expensive. Don't have one pair. A good guess, though. Someone, I think third period said latex paint, pre-latex paint. Every French soldier had a little pouch of talcum powder. And they would put the talcum powder on, and now they're white again.
Oh.
And if you hit them, they're like a powder ball. Okay, so when they arrived there, they got to the James Peninsula, and Cornwallis is sitting in Yorktown waiting for the Royal Navy that's never going to come. And so at the end of September, all of a sudden, there is the entire, all of Washington's army, about 50-50 British and French. And they tried to take it by storm first, just attack the fortification, and they failed. And so then they surrounded them to starve them out. What do we call that when you surround an enemy to starve them out? It's a siege. And if you're actually doing it, you're besieging them. So if you ever see this term, and then add BE, besiege, means you're the one, I'm besieging them. So that's what it means, surrounding them. And they could do it now because the French Navy was there. And the British, they still got another couple months of hurricane season, so they got an opening. They dug trenches. Here's where the British were. They dug trenches around, and then what they did, it's called parallels. They shelled them, and yeah, the French could kind of hit what they're aiming at. The Continentals couldn't practice, so they were embarrassed by that too. But what they did is this. They would start digging trenches like this, straight at them at night. And then, I think you probably guess what's going to happen. Then they dig another trench like that. And so you get closer and closer. And so when you do actually rush, you're really close to them. You emerge from your trench and attack. And at the middle of October, when a British redoubt, which is a fortified position right here, was finally taken by Continental Army. In fact, this attack was led by Washington's adjutant. Very young orphan. Yeah.
Was it Hamilton?
It's Hamilton, yeah. Hamilton is a really interesting guy. And yes, there's the Broadway play. When I was in New York City a couple months ago, this time of year, a couple years ago, when Hamilton was at its height of popularity, my wife and I looked at getting tickets. We thought that'd be, it's such a big deal. I know it's not that historically accurate, but I think it'd be a great show. Tickets were $1,000 a piece. So we got 100 tickets. We figured, let's just enjoy the whole dome. Yeah, so we decided we'll catch Hamilton another time. And But when that happened, we'll get to Hamilton. He is a very interesting man. Cornwallis couldn't hold out. And after this, he surrendered. October 19th, or just simply October 1781, Yorktown, Cornwallis surrendered. This would end the war. Politically, Britain decided it's not worth it anymore. This would be the end. And remember, all wars are political. Politically, they decided it's not worth it anymore. Let's cut our losses. It's not over. There's still, it can still go south on the new United States, but Cornwallis was humiliated after surrendering to a bunch of dumb colonials, these incompetent, ignorant people. And so he refused to go to the surrender ceremony. The ceremony was the British soldiers would all stack their arms, the enlisted men, and they would be paroled. And then the officers would surrender to British officers. And the idea was Cornwallis would surrender to Washington. He didn't want to do it because he was embarrassed and bad. So he faked illness. How does an officer surrender? What do they present to the enemy officer? Their dry razor pen. Naturally. Sword. They give their sword. Well, Cornwallis sent his adjutant. And his adjutant did not even look at Washington, which was right in front. He went right to Rochambeau. Rochambeau refused to accept and just kind of nodded to Washington. Washington was furious at this slight. Not only because Cornwallis wasn't there, but then he went to Rochambeau. So Washington pointed to his adjutant, Benjamin Lincoln. He surrendered to Benjamin Lincoln. Okay, kind of childish, but that's how they surrendered. And one more thing. A British regimental band played a very popular song at the time. You know what a waltz is? That was the really kind of the hip kids' music at the time. That's what the young people really liked. And older people did not like waltzes. What music are you into now? It's waltzes. Is it waltzes? I thought it was polkas. But whatever you guys are into, the waltz they played, it's actually not a very good song, I don't think. But it was called The World Turned Upside Down. It wasn't planned, it just was a popular song they played right when this music was in the background. But you think of the impact that the Declaration of Independence is going to have. The U.S. survived. And this will influence the French Revolution and revolutionary movements to this day. And so I guess Turned Upside Down was pretty appropriate. So Yorktown surrendered, and now they begin to negotiate. But two more things before we get to the Treaty of Paris. First off, in beautiful, oh, let's not go to Newburgh. Let's go right to the West. In the West, there's fighting along the frontier. Much like the French and Indian War, where you had allies of each other fighting and colonists fighting. Well, American Indians, especially west of the Appalachian Mountains, they joined, which side? Did they fight with the new United States or the British? American Indians. Yeah, almost all of them fought with the British. Now, they didn't fight that hard, but I can't even write. Let's start over again. They fought with the British. Their logic was, going back to the proclamation of 1763, the British might keep these colonies from expanding and taking their land. So they made a very pragmatic decision, not because they liked the British. But then to the new United States, they saw it as American Indians, well, if they're helping the British, then they're fair game. And so this would be an excuse to attack various tribes to take their land. And the most famous of this, and it's complex, it shows our American history is complex, George Rogers Clark would lead this irregular militia force that, when he was a very young man, he led something similar to the French and Indian War. They would all dress in green, and they had mastered the tactics of the frontier, what we call guerrilla tactics. He called his unit, it was Rogers Rangers. The Rangers. And they went all down the Ohio River, basically attacking tribes, but taking all the way down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, where present-day Cairo, Illinois is. It's spelled Cairo, but they pronounce it Cairo there, right here. And this would give the United States a claim to the Mississippi River. This would be crucial for the treaty negotiation. George Rogers Clark. Now, a couple of things about Clark, or about his Rangers, too. In World War II, the United States copied the British and made these irregular forces. The British called them commandos. They would do secret operations, go behind enemy lines. The United States, dipping back in its history, called them Rangers. So if you know about the U.S. Army Rangers, that's where they come from. George Rogers Clark Rangers. They still carry all Rangers. You have a little piece of paper, and it has George Rogers Clark's 12 Lessons of Fighting, of what he learned about fighting on the frontier. So a former student of mine in the Rangers, and last time I was here, I kind of just remembered now. Let me see George Rogers Clark's lessons. They're a little laminated piece of paper that they still give the Rangers today. I'm worried he might be in Syria right now, so it's kind of concerning. But that's where Rangers come from. And part B. Clark is going to be one of the most famous Americans of this time. But his younger brother will eventually overshadow him. Who's his younger brother? I was wondering if somebody was going to say, Lewis Clark. No! It's Meriwether Lewis, and his brother was William Clark. I heard somebody say William Clark. And so they were co-captains of the Corps of Discovery, and so that's George Rogers Clark. Now, yeah, they met in Paris. No question, right?
Yes.
Where's my pizza?
There's still some left, I'm pretty sure. There's a ton.
I know, that's one thing I do miss. All right. I'm just talking to myself now. Back to Washington. Washington is still in Rhode Island, and his #1 task is keeping that army together. Because even though they surrendered at Yorktown, there's still a huge British army in New York. And if Washington's army dissolves, because it looked like it still could fall apart, the British can still win. Remember, this is political. And if the British decide, hey, we can win, they can start it up again. So, by the end of 1782, Washington's army was literally on the verge of mutiny. They had had enough. And this mutiny will soon be called the Newburgh Crisis, little town in New Jersey, or Rhode Island. The Newburgh Crisis. It's a mutiny. You know what a mutiny means? I say mutiny, what does that mean? You know? Maybe not kill them, but yeah, you basically quit obeying your officers, quit obeying the command, and take over. Like the most famous would be on a ship where you quit obeying the captain. Well, they weren't necessarily mutinying against Washington. What they were mad about was the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress had promised them money and land, better supplies, better food, and what did they deliver? None of that. They're living in hovels, it's cold, they're without food, they're miserable. And how they've been paying them was with, how does government borrow money again? Bonds. They're paying with bonds. So the idea is, down the road, they'll pay them. And the soldiers are thinking basically twofold. First off, I need money now. But secondly, this government is so weak and inept, I might have nothing. The bonds might be worthless. What they want is to mutiny against the Continental Congress, march on Philadelphia, and make Washington dictator, which probably would have meant at this time king. That's what they wanted. They wanted Washington to overthrow the government, and the United States would not have happened. Well, Washington is desperate because he knows if the British get word of a full-fledged mutiny, that army from New York will come out, it will defeat a divided army, it might be over again. It was really that close. And so Washington had to convince him to not mutiny. So in a meeting hall in Newburgh, Rhode Island, basically think of almost like a tavern with a few benches in it, all the officers came in, and they are mad, grumbling and upset. Washington came in with another letter from the Continental Congress. You know, one of those, we promised to pay you, you know, all that kind of stuff. And he started reading it, just reading the first few words, and the men aren't listening. I mean, just anger is rippling off them. And Washington stops. He reaches in his pocket and pulls out a pair of reading glasses. And he kind of bends down to read again, and he could tell everything has changed. All the men are just like this looking at him. You know, Washington had this reputation of this stoic commander. You know, he had led from the front at Princeton. One musket ball went through his hat, another one through his shoulder sleeve, and he came out fine. He had this kind of reputation. And here he is putting reading glasses on. And all of a sudden he looked a lot older. And he looked up at the men, you can tell, they just had changed, you could feel it. And he said, men, this has been a long war. And we have all had to make sacrifices. And then he started to read.
It's a drill.
You all started to read.
Good afternoon, staff and students. As previously promised, at this time, we are just going to conduct that lockdown drill. Before you close and lock the door, please check the hallway to see if there are any individuals who need to enter your room. If there are any
We don't want the
restrooms,
riffraff
please
in
check
here.
these for individuals as well. Just as a reminder, you would not do this.
I'm not saying we don't need
to the emergency at hand. So once again, at this time, we are just going to perform a lockdown drill.
Oh, one thing,
This is a
serious.
drill.
If this does happen, the last person doing the vote, no, you don't have to jump through. That'll come later. We just turn the blinds with that job, and you just shut the window. We don't have to now. If it did really happen, I'm not kidding about that.
Wait, how do you close these blinds?
Just lower, you see it on the left, the far left, there's a little crane. Everyone watch. Someone.
Wait, are we doing?
No. Just in case, we're in pretty good shape here. It's nice being in the basement. If something like that happens, we'd probably go over here.
Really?
Yeah. Cinder block, closet, safest place. This is all just, a couple pieces of plywood, so we don't want to be right there. Okay, so, everyone happy now? The men start. Literally, the men start to cry.
Okay, at this time, the lockdown drill is over. Thank you very much for your cooperation and your assistance in helping to make Capitol High School a safer environment. Have a great day. Go Bruins.
So, the men start to cry. I mean, they just couldn't handle it. They realized, he has given so much, we can give a little bit more. It worked. He didn't even read another full sentence. Washington just walked out, and the mutiny had ended. Brilliant play acting. I mean, it was brilliant. He set him up. He was kind of hoping it would work, and it worked perfect. The men dropped the mutiny, the army survived, and now meeting in Paris, you could have a peace agreement. Washington was an interesting guy. So, the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The two main negotiators for the new United States were John Adams and Ben Franklin. It seemed like a good choice. Adams and Franklin were co-authors of the Declaration of Independence, even though Jefferson wrote the most. And Franklin was really famous. Adams, a well-known lawyer, both very intelligent. Franklin had been the ambassador to many colonies before the war. And so, it seemed like a good choice. They actually did not get along at all. Adams was all over the place, very emotional. would yell at people, all this kind of stuff. And Franklin thought he was crazy. Franklin thought John Adams was a maniac. Adams thought Franklin was a degenerate. Franklin was one of the most famous people in the world, and he had all these people just crowd him, just want to talk to him, or especially young women. So he basically had a harem of young women wherever he went. And so Adams thought he was a degenerate. That and the fact that Franklin used to like to walk around the streets of Paris naked. And I just find that very odd, but he did. It was liberating. So it seemed to confirm the degenerate part. The other problem they had is this. France, Spain, the Netherlands, they didn't care anything about the United States. They didn't fight the war for an independent U.S. So they basically had to negotiate with the British alone. But this would be the treaty. And remember, if Washington's army wouldn't have survived, it wouldn't have mattered. Number one, the U.S. will become independent. Now, there's going to be arguments exactly what that means, but the U.S. is independent. Number two, the U.S. would get a significant amount of land. They get all the land east of the Mississippi because of Clark, between Canada, which was still British, and Florida, which went back to the Spanish. If you look at this map right here, it's huge. Look at all this land they got. They more than doubled their land. But because of the mountains, to make this land viable and to keep it in the Union, which was a real concern back then, number three, they could use the Mississippi River, M-I-S-S-I-S-S,
F-U-B-I.
the Mississippi River, and New Orleans. That's with ordinance. This pin is at the end. Look at this thing. Commerce. My pin was going, so there. So the Mississippi River and New Orleans for commerce, because it was Spanish. So it was supposed to be open without tolls. And number four, money owed to the British, aka we'll just call it British debt, had to be paid. So any money owed to British citizens or British banks, the United States had to guarantee its payment. So debt to Britain or British debt paid. And lastly, number six. Number six, what happened to five? Loyalists who lost their land, a lot of them fled after Yorktown, they would get their land back. U.S. independent, land east of the Mississippi, Mississippi and New Orleans for commerce, British debt, and loyalists get their land. There are a few more things, but these are the basic elements of the treaty. Fishing rights and a few other things. But major victory for the United States. But the United States didn't really have a government. The British stayed in New York till 1784, waited till the winter to end, then they evacuated. And that is when Washington disbanded his army. And Washington did something that really surprised people. He went home. He did not try to take power. He did not try to dominate the new government. He retired and went home. One more thing about Washington that's really important to understand about Washington. He was, don't think in terms of political parties. He was a Republican. He believed in a republic, a representative government. He did not believe in democracy, but he believed in a republic. And so he believed that a republic must have representatives and not a dictator. He admired the Roman senator Cincinnatus, who took power in the 2nd century BC in Rome, when it's still a republic, and then gave power back when the threat was over. So that's what he was going to be, his reputation. Yeah.
When did talks kind of turn from like talks of forming a republic to more like talks of being in democracy?
We've never been in democracy.
I guess when did that word become more common?
1830s. But we've never been in democracy. But what democracy changed its meaning. democracy more and more to a lot of Americans would come to mean that the people are ultimately powerful. So you remember the social contract?
Yeah.
That's what Americans begin to refer to as democracy. But democracy literally means that we would vote on everything. And they didn't want anything like that. They didn't want the riffraff, aka you people, to have any power. But 1830s, Andrew Jackson. So with this, yeah, people say we're a democracy now. But one more thing. A new form of government was created. The Articles of Confederation. This was actually done a few years earlier, but it would take power basically at the end of 1783 to 1789. And it was going to be a decentralized government.
What a confederation?
Articles.
Articles.
And this is sometimes it would just be the Articles. Sometimes you see it called the Confederacy or the Confederation. And it was going to be decentralized. No strong central government, no strong single leader. They were fearful of tyranny. And they thought, let's decentralize it. And to their point of view, not quite democratic, but more people having power. And it was a disaster. And it was almost immediately noticeable in the treaty. They couldn't force the Loyalists to get their land back, so did the Loyalists ever get their land back? No. In fact, the last lawsuit I've seen about Loyalists, descendants of Loyalists, they live in Canada now, who tried to get their land in Virginia. That was taken away from them back in 1782. It's 2 years ago. But it's so hard to do the property requirements, it's hard to get to. British debt? Nah. The Spanish said, we're going to just charge tolls. We don't care. The British never left the Great Lakes region. At least never at that time. Eventually. Right? And so, couldn't even enforce the most basic element of a treaty. Wouldn't it be awesome if Thursday, the day after the test, you could fill out a little chart and go through the individual weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation while you read Chapter 6? The answer is yes. That would be great. That's what you're doing in class on Thursday. So please bring your textbooks. You have to read that. But in case you forget it, you can look. You can use a review book that's back there, and please put it back and use them. But it won't be quite as good. And when you finish that, you will turn that in. And you have any time to read Chapter 6 out of America. So I've got that America. That's what you need. I'm telling you this now because the test might take all period for some of you. And on Friday.
How many questions are there on the test?
25 multiple choice and 5 short IDs. And the multiple choice, that's a lot. It's a good test. It's a normal test. As we go on the test, we'll get bigger.
Really?
Not more questions, you're not using bigger paper. And no, they'll get more because you get faster and more efficient, right? And on Friday, we're going to watch a video called Hamilton and Jefferson, Man in the State. And it's not only really good, it talks about the different point of view of what kind of country are we going to be. With a strong central government, urban, industrial, or more rural, states will have more control. Agricultural. What kind of country are we going to be? And that is represented by Jefferson and Hamilton. But this movie it's pretty amazing. The special effects are going to blow you away. Men fly, they disappear, and they have the reanimation. I know. So what am I going to set up? I'll make sure the sub has the key to open up the cry room across there in case you need to go and get your emotions out, then come back. Some of you, I don't think we'll be able to handle it. There will be a worksheet you have to do with it, and that will take up about 2/3 of the period, and then anytime you have after that, you can read Chapter 6. Sound good? Because I'm not going to be here. Are there any questions from the review list as I hand this out? Yes?
What are the committees of Congress?
Those were created in the First Continental Congress, but basically it's to spread patriotic information. Propaganda. So like after the Tea Party, they can spread all the information.
Okay.
About 8 Washington.
What's that?
Eight Washington.
Oh, it's not. I didn't quite hit the control button. Or the shift button to get the asterisk. So some people have 8 Washington, and some people have asterisk Washington, right? Yeah. Who has an asterisk by Washington? Raise your hand. Anybody? Does everybody have an 8 by Washington? Oh, that's pretty funny. Yeah. Abigail Adams won't be on the test. It's going to be on the next year that I didn't. Chapter 6 has them. Has them in there, that's not. Right. Go ahead and ask a question. I'll answer. Just have to. Yes.
And then for the invasion of New York, is that just like the battle?
Yeah, Battle of Long Island. The thing about that one is how the Battle of Long Island, Washington really lost the whole thing. And so it made the colonists think it's all over. And that's why Trenton and Princeton be such a big deal. And the thing about that is you're not going to have no exact dates. And if you know the basic date for the, this is out of 10. And the big answer points out that either I think you didn't quite answer it completely, or you didn't really try to give me some kind of the importance of it shallow. Reads the skipping.
What is that say?
The result. What's the result? A little bit more about that.
What does this one say?
So is mercantilism just the tagline goal?
No, mercantilism is the British policy to try to get as much gold in their coffers as possible. So that's to maximize exports, to use the colonies for raw materials. And what's the British laws? The British laws that did mercantilism. Someone said it? Yeah, the Trade and Navigation Act. Yeah, you make a play.
What is this emphasize?
Good, but rephrase.
I thought it was an emphasize.
I walk when I grade. I get really tired of sitting.
Maybe like a bicycle.
Oh, yeah. And I should stop when I write. I know. But I don't. Marion is skipping. So somebody wadded your paper up and threw it at the speakers.
Hi. Okay, cool.
Zoe. I have to find your name. Yes. All right. You want to hear? The Townshend duties, another name for them is the Townshend Acts, and duties just mean tax. And what the Townshend Acts did was this was after the Stamp Act failed, and they tried one more time to cut those taxes for the Navigation Acts, but they enforced them with the Quartering Act. And that would lead to the Boston Massacre. So that was that tax. No, yeah.
Just for Washington, like everything about.
The big thing about Washington you have to know is his ultimate strategy, and then I think.
You mean the ultimate strategy as a side attack?
Yeah, survival. How he didn't really win many battles, but he ultimately survived, and how he kept the army together, and that includes the Newburgh Crisis. That was another one. He kept that army together. He lost almost every battle he fought. But you know what? Who cares? Of course, he was a slaveholder and a lot of other problems. We have an interesting history. Well, you know, that's always happened. Any? Yes.
Slavery or like.
Oh, the big thing about the slave, how the South, they hate, they were worried that the Declaration of Independence would encourage slaves to rebel. And yet the British very actively recruited slaves and gave them their freedom. You have this weird kind of thing where you have a people fighting for liberty and slavery. That's the definition of a contradiction. Any other ones? I'll be glad to answer. We're rolling. Yes. Huh? That was Ben Franklin's attempt to unify all 13 colonies right before the French and Indian War. Didn't work. And the reason we have to mention that is that showed the colonies didn't like each other. But the Stamp Act would bring them together with the Stamp Act colony. So it took a common enemy.
The southern versus northern, was that big chart?
Yeah, and the more diversified economy in the north, but the south was mostly plantation. Yeah. And that's what I just was right there about American Indians support the British and George Rogers Clark and his Rangers didn't claim. And a lot of these will be parts of multiple choice questions. Some multiple choice questions will be really basic, some will not be. When you answer a multiple choice question, if you do not know the answer, what should you do? No. Put a little, don't even do that. If you get to one you don't know, immediately put a little dot or something by it. Then move on. Then go back. Don't waste your limited short-term memory about one you're not sure about. Go back, then figure it out. Then try to use process of elimination to come up with the best answer. Don't leave anything blank. But if you really start thinking about one you don't know, then it will affect your next few answers. You'll be kind of thinking about it, your mind won't be clear. That's where you get like 3 or 4 multiple choice wrong in a row for some people. So you get mad about one they missed and screw up the next ones. So put a dot, move on, come back. Yes?
So for your term, is that going to be like part of a short idea?
I don't have Yorktown for sure any. So just as long as you know that that's what the last battle would agree on. And allow themselves to get surrounded. And hurricane season allows the French Navy. I think that is a multiple choice question. That's a pretty important one. Tomorrow before school, I'm around here, about 20 to 8, down at the 0 period. And I'll usually hang out here at lunch. Sometimes I go upstairs, but usually hang out here with Mr. Diola. Huh? Nah. Sometimes I go off, but I get too tired. Oh, when? When did you come in?
I tried getting a lunch.
Oh, really? Yeah, I might have went real quick. I don't know. Good. That's just a random line. I make random lines all the time. I don't even know why I do it.
I was wondering if it's that or if it meant that was your
Most interesting.
Oh, we have a quiz today!
I was like, what? I was receiving. I'm like, my God.
Hey, Partridge. Oh, yeah. I got a PowerPoint.
Okay, why don't we wait after the quiz and then
I just
share it with me.
share with you.
Go to LBJ for the USA 1. Yeah, do it real quick. Hey, we all have choices. Up, down. Let's have a meeting. I'll get all the principals. All the principals together. Before you go. You were gone. You've been gone for like a week. That's not that number. No, you have to. Running down a dream. Why do you say that?
We were talking about dreams and
How do you mean?
What? Wow.
I love talking
I'm
about
Oh, yeah. Somebody brought me a Kit Kat yesterday, so they automatically get 150%. It's not a bribe, I'm just pragmatic.
I'm pragmatically. You just gotta bribe all your students to vote for you and then you'll
exact number.
Are you guys coming up with the questions now?
Yes.
Period. Killing it. Can I know I problems I heard inside. We're I don't think so. Why is that?
And then there was a moratorium, so the first one was Highland, but the second one, and then that makes sense. No, they were, people's names that died, and
No feeling.
Half sheet of paper, number 1 to 6.
I see how it is. I'm so angry.